Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 1, New France and British North America, 1713 to 1800. This is Lesson Number 5, were the British justified in expelling the Acadians? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Can you think of any examples of people being forced to leave their homes and their country? If so, do you know why they were forced to move to another part of the world? This may be a question which you want to share with your parents or an older relative because they may be able to give you examples that are from before your time. In any event, I want you to put the video on pause so that you can discuss this question with your parents or other relatives at home. Jot down your answers and we'll talk about it in our next class. All right, let's proceed. In today's lesson, we are going to learn about one of the saddest and most shameful chapters in Canadian history, the Acadian expulsion. Between 1755 and 1763, thousands of Acadians were violently removed from their homes, had their property destroyed, and were forced onto ships that were sent to unfamiliar lands. Today, historians continue to debate whether the British had the right to force the Acadians to leave and to take their land. And this is just one of many famous paintings which depicts the forced removal of Acadians from their homes. Looking at this painting, do you think the Acadians had any other choice but to leave their homes? Something we'll talk about in tomorrow's class. In a previous lesson, we learned that Acadia was originally a French colony which was given to the British in 1713 as a result of the Treaty of Utrecht. The Acadians, who were of French descent, were given the option to relocate to other lands in New France. However, many refused because they did not want to leave the farms they and their ancestors lived on. The British were concerned about the Acadians staying in Acadia because it meant that there would still be a large French-speaking community that could one day join in an attack on the British. In 1730, the British and the Acadians reached an agreement. The Acadians would be allowed to keep practicing the Catholic faith, and the Acadians would sign an oath declaring their loyalty to King George II. The British agreed that the Acadians would not have to side with the British against the French in any future conflicts. The Acadians would be known as the Neutral French. As time went on, tensions grew between the Acadians and the British. France and Britain were about to go to war. In 1755, British Governor Charles Lawrence demanded that the Acadians sign an oath of allegiance which would require them to fight the French. The Acadians refused. In 1755, Britain ordered the expulsion of the Acadians. As many as 10,000 Acadians were rounded up and put on ships destined for Europe or what is now the United States. Some Acadians managed to escape into the forest and find refuge with French or First Nations communities that were nearby. Others died of starvation and exposure to the cold. One-third of the Acadians who were placed on ships died of disease before reaching their destination. In the terror and confusion, some families were separated and never reunited. After the Acadians were expelled, the British burned down their farms so that the Acadians would have no reason to return. And you can actually see a number of statues still in North America. One here depicting the flight of one young Acadian family. And here another painting from the time period showing the British burning down an Acadian farmstead. Historians believe the main reason the British expelled the Acadians was to take their land. The British had tried creating settlements in the Ohio River Valley, but this was taking too long due to the attacks by the French and the First Nations. Acadia had an abundance of rich farmland since the Acadians had developed an effective system of dikes to drain the saltwater marshes. The Acadians were Catholic and British settlers were Protestant. British officials felt that the British would not want to live in Acadia if they had to share the land with French Catholics. The British also felt threatened by the First Nations tribes that lived in or near Acadia. The Micmac and Malecite tribes were allies of the French, and they saw the British occupation of Acadia as illegal. In 1749, the British built a fortress at Halifax and brought 2,500 settlers to the area. The British tried to negotiate with the Micmac and Malecite, but they simply wanted the British to leave. The breakdown in negotiations led to attacks between both sides. During these attacks, the Micmac abducted more than 1,000 settlers, many of them children. To protect the settlers, the governor of Nova Scotia and founder of Halifax, Edward Cornwallis, brought in more troops and offered rewards to settlers and soldiers for killing Micmac people. Prior to being expelled, the Acadians had very close ties to the Micmac. There were many mixed Acadian-Micmac marriages, and the Acadians resented the British just as much as the Micmac. The Acadians joined in on some of the Micmac raids, which the British later used to justify expelling the Acadians. Joseph Brunard, who you see in this painting on the left, was one of the most active leaders of the Acadian resistance. His legendary acts gained the secret admiration of many Acadians and Micmac. Broussard led an Acadian First Nations mission to defend Fort Beausejour, a French fort that had been built on land claimed by both the British and French. The British also felt threatened by the French government. The British felt that the Treaty of Utrecht had given all of the disputed land near Acadia to Britain. However, the French disagreed and continued building forts near Acadia. The British feared that France was actively encouraging the Acadian and Micmac resistance in Acadia. The Acadians who were deported had great difficulty settling in the British colonies they were sent to. The most successful settlement was in New Orleans, Louisiana. The people who lived there were French-speaking Catholics. Over time, the nearly 2,600 Acadians who settled in Louisiana came to be known as Cajuns, and this was the flag which they flew, as you can also see in this painting on the left. In 1764, the British allowed the Acadians to return to Acadia. Nearly 3,000 returned, only to find that their land had been given to British settlers. Many of the returnees settled in what is now New Brunswick. Over the last 250 years, these former Acadians and their descendants created a new Acadian community. In 2003, Canada's Governor General, Adrian Clarkson, issued a formal acknowledgment of the British government's expulsion of the Acadians. Clarkson made the acknowledgment on behalf of Queen Elizabeth. However, Clarkson did not make a formal apology on behalf of the Canadian and British governments, something which present day descendants of the Acadians are still in search of. So let's wrap up today's lesson by discussing the following. Number one, do you feel that the British were justified for expelling the Acadians? And why do you feel this way? And number two, instead of expelling the Acadians, what do you think the British could have done to deal with French and native threats and to protect themselves against future threats? So I want you to put the video on pause so that you can take another look at these two questions and write down your responses to both of these because we will discuss these in tomorrow's class. If you don't feel confident in your ability to answer these two questions, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least a couple of more times, and then when you're ready, put the video on pause. All right. Look forward to hearing everybody's responses in our next class. But until then, this concludes today's video.